Hello and welcome to this video, where I want to take a look at this old Philips CRT. And really, I just wanted to play around with this thing as a bit of practice RGB modding something that isn't a Sony. I quite like some of the old Philips TVs and I thought tinkering with this might give it a bit more use for those into retro gaming. This is a 29PT468/A from around, I would guess, the mid-90s. It's a 29-inch model with stereo sound and even a little subwoofer speaker. It has 3 composite inputs and will even take S-Video. It'll also do PAL and NTSC, so from the get-go it's not a bad TV at all. I quite like the look of some of Philips' older products too. They have that quality look to them in most cases. Now, I got this TV from a friend who had it stored in a warehouse for many years. The time came for him to clear out some stuff, and a big old chunky CRT does take up a lot of room. I thought it would be nice to see if it worked and see how hard it would be getting RGB plumbed into it. I think underneath all this warehouse dust and dirt is a good honest TV ready to come back into action. So here's a look inside it. It's got a Philips tube, and here is the model number. And here you can see that extra speaker, as Philips call it the power woofer. Now, just having a general look inside, there's nothing that stands out as alarming. It just needs a good dust out. I will give the whole set a good clean inside and out. Schematics for this exact model seemed a little hard to find, but what I'm looking for off the get-go is the TV's video processor, or as it's also called, the jungle chip. Practically all TVs of this era will have a video processor in them, which handles inputs and outputs. These can be the key to a straightforward RGB mod. Now, I will confess that a lot of Sony Trinitrons I've messed around with used Philips video chips that I'm quite familiar with. So going into this, I was pretty confident, this being a Philips, that it would use something very similar, and I was correct. You can see the video chip here, a Philips TDA8366. This is good news. It's a very easy chip to work with when it comes to feeding in RGB. With RGB mods, I find if you can't get the service manual for a particular TV, identifying the jungle chip, if it has one, is a good way to get started. In the case of this TV, I'll be using the datasheet for the TDA8366 and working backwards. You can see here the pinout for the 8366 and its RGB inputs. Notice it has a switch too. I'll be able to follow these video chip pins backwards on the TV to try and find a good insertion point for my RGB input. You'll find on some TVs that terminating resistors and decoupling capacitors are already in place, and I found that to be the case here. But before I get too excited, we should probably turn the set on and actually make sure everything is working. I've got a little Famiclone set up here just to test composite in. This will also test the NTSC 60Hz of this set. And success. Now, I probably don't need to say it at this point, but don't be fooled by the recording of this CRT. The image does look absolutely fine in person. The only thing I did notice was a slight tilt towards the left, but that's something I can fix later. No loud bangs or pops, no messed up picture, I'm pretty keen to get started. I would have gone full steam ahead with this mod, but the weather took a turn for the worse. Now, that normally wouldn't matter because I'm working indoors in my shed, but the sheer intensity of the rain was driving visitors into the shed and water was starting to pool in at the door. I thought this was a good sign to pack up and call it a night. And yes, once the rain had subsided, I released this little guy back onto some grass so we can make a loud noise all night. So with a new and dry day, I got to work finding where I want to start plumbing in my RGB. I decided to connect as close to the video chip as I can, just prior to the decoupling capacitors. Now, I've made a very quick and messy setup here just to test that things are working. I have a PlayStation 1 with a SCART lead going into a SCART socket. At this stage, I'm just feeding the red channel into the TV, along with sync through composite, and 5 volts through a resistor, which will go to the video chip's RGB switch. All of this comes from the SCART socket itself and from the PS1. I also included a switch on the 5 volt line so I can manually toggle RGB on and off for testing. In most cases, when using SCART cables with consoles, there's a 5 volt output fed to pin 16 on the SCART connector. I'll be using the 5 volts from SCART to make the TV automatically switch to RGB when a console using the correct cables is connected. I prefer doing things this way so I don't need to hack in switches and toggles to the TV's case. This makes the mod work almost like a factory setup. To help explain, here is an overview of how this mod works, and please forgive my crude diagram. The PlayStation sends RGB, composite and 5 volts to the SCART connector. We send the RGB to the video chip in the TV, we send the composite to one of the TV's AV inputs so we can use the sync from it, and 5 volts is also sent to the video chip, but through a resistor, as the video chip needs between 1 volts to 3 volts to switch to RGB correctly. The end result is an RGB image that will sync properly when you select the same AV input as you've sent the composite signal to. So I've now added all 3 RGB wires to the TV, and I'm using a 270 ohm resistor on the 5 volt line. Everything is working properly, which is great. The only issue is, as is common in RGB mods, my picture has shifted to the left quite a bit. Now I know how to get into the service menus for Sony's, but not for Philips. I scoured online for ages trying to find out how to access a service menu, and no combination of buttons on the remote would work. I eventually found a service manual for a similar TV to this one. It wasn't quite the same, but it mentioned temporarily jumping 2 test points inside the TV. I was able to find some similar test points and gave it a go. And it worked. We have access to a service menu. I nudged the picture a little bit more to the right to get it centered. Speaking of the picture, I also adjusted the yoke very slightly to help alleviate that tilt to the left. It's hard to capture the image well, but it's really very good, especially considering it is a larger screen and I'm using the cheapest of cables. Is it as good as the equivalent Trinitron? Well, no, not quite, but if you're sitting back just casually gaming, this is absolutely great and I'd happily use it. With our RGB picture working and dialed in, I fitted a SCART socket to the rear of the TV, tidied up my wiring and began putting everything back together. I also made sure to give the inside a good dust out, and the outside is now also cleaned up. The screen has had a good wipe down and polish, so there's nothing left to do with this. Maybe down the line a bit more of a service to the capacitors would be good, but for now it's fine. And we're back to where we began, only this time we have a nice clean TV with a neat little upgrade that might give it some more years of use to someone. I do like the look of these mid-90s CRTs. They remind me of what we had when growing up, although I don't think we ever had anything quite this big. I've got some other projects to get on with, so I'll likely move this TV on so someone else can get some good use out of it. I'm just glad it didn't go to the trash. I hope you've enjoyed taking a look at this old Philips TV and my attempt to give it a bit more use and life. I'll leave you with a last look at this TV now that it's all finished, playing one of my all-time favourite old school games. As always, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you next time.